Okay, have you ever considered that massive, highly publicized failure might actually be the secret engine driving world-changing innovation? It sounds completely counterintuitive, right? We're basically conditioned from birth to avoid failure at all costs. But today, in this explainer, we're going to look at one of the most successful companies in human history and explore how their ability to literally engineer and embrace failure is exactly what makes them so incredibly dominant. We're diving into the paradox of Google. Okay, let's dive into this. 299. That is a staggering number, isn't it? According to tracking data, that's the exact number of products, apps, services, and hardware that Google has officially killed off. I mean, it's a massive tech graveyard. Now, for any normal company, discontinuing nearly 300 products would be a sign of absolute disaster. It would bankrupt them. But for Alphabet, Google's parent company, they remain one of the most highly valued tech giants on the planet. So how on earth does a trillion-dollar company survive such a massive graveyard of dead ideas?
Well, as you'll see, even giants stumble, and they often do it very, very publicly. Just look at this timeline. Back in 2009, they launched Google Wave. Remember that? It was this ambitious, futuristic form of email and collaboration. Then, by 2011, they tried to take on Facebook with Google+. Right after that, in 2012, the world watched the debut of Google Glass, a wildly hyped augmented reality headset. But by 2019, both Google Plus and Glass were officially shut down. And these weren't quiet behind-the-scenes experiments. No way! These were major, highly publicized launches that just ultimately fizzled out.
So exactly why do these massive bets fail? Well, let's break it down. Wave was simply too confusing and abstract for users to really adopt. Google Plus failed because it honestly didn't offer any compelling innovation over existing platforms like Facebook or Instagram. It felt like a clone. And Google Glass? Well, it carried a hefty $1,500 price tag and was just poorly marketed to a public that totally wasn't ready for it. But here's the secret. These high-profile missteps are actually a calculated cost of doing business. Google absolutely expects this. And to understand why, we've got to look at the leadership that built this culture.
Which brings us to Section 1, Leadership Built on Risk.
You see, this culture of acceptable failure, it doesn't just happen by accident. It starts right at the top with co-founder Larry Page, who really embodied what's known as transformational leadership. Now, this approach is all about motivating employees through a shared vision of advancement. Page used this exact style to shift Google's focus away from immediate short-term profits. Instead, he directed their sights toward long-term impact. He wanted the company to address basic human requirements, things like productivity, connectivity, and information availability. Because think about it, when you're optimizing for the long-term future of humanity rather than just the next quarterly earnings report, your tolerance for risk completely changes.
We can actually break down this leadership style using Kouzes and Posner's 5 practices of exemplary leadership. Page definitely modeled the way through transparency, and he inspired a shared vision with the massive goal to organize the world's information. But I really want to draw your attention to the third point here: challenge the process. Page actively encouraged risk-taking and experimentation. He championed the famous 20% time policy, basically allowing staff to spend a chunk of their work week on unconventional personal projects. And that specific challenge to the traditional corporate process, that's what birthed massive successes like Gmail and Google News.
Let's move on to Section 2, Inside the Moonshot Factory.
So Google took that philosophy of challenging the process, combined it with total psychological safety, and literally systematized it into an entire division known as X, the Moonshot Factory. Now, most standard companies fight tooth and nail for just a 10% incremental improvement over the status quo. It's safe, it's predictable, but X demands a 10x massive impact. To even be considered an X project, it's got to solve a problem affecting millions or billions of people, it must require an audacious sci-fi-sounding technology, and it must be achievable in the next 5 to 10 years. They are absolutely not looking for better, they are looking for radical.
Now, to build sci-fi technology, you need a very specific type of mind. X actively seeks out what they call T-shaped teams. These are people with deep expertise in one specific field, but enormous intellectual flexibility to cross over into others. They joyfully apply techniques from one arena to a completely unrelated problem. It's like a giant puzzle to them. For example, when X was building Project Loon, which used high-altitude balloons to provide internet access, they needed to figure out how to stop the balloons from leaking. So who did they bring in? They brought in scientists who specialized in Doritos bags, condoms, and sausage casings. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. That is the pure essence of a T-shaped problem solver.
But how do you even manage all these wild ideas? Well, X uses a brutal but highly efficient 4-step pipeline. Step 1 is rapid evaluation, where a few $1,000s and a few weeks are used to try and actively kill dozens of ideas by finding their biggest risks immediately. The ideas that somehow survive move to Step 2, extended investigations, for deep techno-economic analysis. If they make it through that gauntlet, they enter Step 3, the Foundry, which is an incubator stage that lasts about a year to prove it can actually be a real business. And finally, Step 4 is graduation, where the project becomes an independent company or integrates right into Google. It's essentially an industrial factory for de-risking the future.
This takes us to Section 3, the art of killing ideas.
Now, this is the most crucial and, honestly, perhaps the most difficult part of the entire Moonshots factory pipeline. The explicit goal here is to actively try to destroy your own projects. Astro Teller, who holds the amazing title of Captain of Moonshots at X, has a guiding philosophy for this: fall in love with the problem, not the solution. He argues that teams need to be what he calls responsibly irresponsible. This means you couple that radical 10x thinking with the brutal discipline to identify risks early on. You have to run at the hardest, most likely to fail parts of a project first, because if you spend all your time polishing the easy stuff just to look busy, you aren't actually learning what you need to know to solve the core problem. To enforce this brutal honesty, X uses a brilliantly pragmatic concept called kill signals. When a project starts, the team agrees in advance on specific metrics. If they hit those negative metrics or fail to reach positive ones within a set time frame, they walk away. Immediately. No excuses. This acts as a safety valve. Sure, it stops wasteful spending, but more importantly, it provides total psychological safety. The team knows exactly what failure looks like, so they aren't afraid to declare it when they see it.
Let's look at how this plays out in the real world with Project Foghorn. This team achieved something that sounds like pure magic. They successfully created a technology that turned plain old seawater into carbon-neutral fuel. It was an incredible technological breakthrough that could have genuinely slowed global warming. But they had a kill signal. Their techno-economic analysis showed they couldn't produce this fuel at a cost competitive with regular gasoline at the pump within their time frame. So, despite the amazing tech, their pragmatism kicked in. They hit their kill signal and they actively killed their own project, shelving it entirely.
Now, I know it sounds incredibly harsh to kill such great tech, but ruthlessly killing the weak or unviable ideas is exactly what makes room for the world-changing successes. Just look at the successful graduates of this brutal factory process. You've got Verily, revolutionizing life sciences; Waymo, paving the way for self-driving cars; Google Brain, which literally moved AI into commercial reality; and Flux.org, transforming green building design. These are massive, industry-shifting companies, and they only exist because the X Factory is so incredibly good at killing everything else.
And finally, Section 4, conquering the data era.
So, you might be wondering, why go through all this trouble? Why take these massive, highly risky bets in the first place? Well, it's because Google operates in an environment where incremental thinking simply cannot survive. The scale of the big data phenomenon is just staggering. To put it in perspective, back in 2011, it was reported that 1.8 zettabytes of data were generated in just 2 days. That volume has only accelerated exponentially since then. We're dealing with hundreds of petabytes of video, billions of locations, millions of connected devices. In an era of zettabytes, where the very fabric of our digital reality is expanding faster than we can even comprehend, an incremental 10% improvement is basically standing still. Google absolutely has to take 10x bets just to keep pace with the world.
This environment is defined by the 4 V's of big data: volume, variety, velocity, and value. We've got a massive volume of information, coming in unstructured varieties from audio to text, generating at blistering velocities. But the most important V here is value. There's huge potential hidden in all this data, but it has very low density. Finding that value, extracting the real signal from the infinite noise, requires radical innovation. It requires the exact kind of audacious sci-fi problem-solving that's born from a culture that isn't afraid to fail 299 times just to find one Google Brain.
So, what does this all mean for us? Google's graveyard isn't a sign of weakness. It's literally the blueprint of their success. They've engineered a system where failing quickly, safely, and honestly is the prerequisite for discovering the future. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a question to apply to your own life and work. What kill signals do you need to implement to make room for your own moonshots? What projects are you holding on to that are secretly holding you back? Fall in love with your problems, be responsibly irresponsible, and honestly, don't be afraid to pull the plug. Thanks for joining me, and keep learning.